Daniel Calloway sat alone in the quiet of his home library, the fire in the marble hearth burning low, casting long shadows over the shelves of books that lined the room. He tapped his finger against the arm of his leather chair, a sharp rhythm, betraying his irritation. "Why are the board pushing her on me?" he muttered under his breath. "There are plenty of women in this city, ambitious, sophisticated, perfectly capable of playing the role they want filled. But no, they insist it has to be her. And for 1 year, of all things. Why?" The question lingered in the air like smoke he couldn't clear. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared at the polished mahogany desk across from him. This wasn't about companionship. Daniel had no illusions about that. This was about strategy, control, and the faceless voices behind the company board trying to bend his life to their will. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. When the line clicked open, his tone was clipped and commanding. "Hey, I need everything on Amber Thatcher. Background, history, family ties, the works. I don't care how late you stay up tonight. I want it on my desk by morning." The man on the other end stammered a quick acknowledgement before Daniel hung up without another word. Exhaling, he turned his gaze to the shelves beside him. His hand hovered over a row of old poetry collections, volumes he had collected during his years abroad. He pulled one free, flipping it open to a page he had marked long ago. Words of longing and fate stared back at him, though tonight they brought him no comfort. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Kimberly, his long-serving maid, entered with her usual grace. "Do you need anything before I turn in for the night?" she asked, her voice low, careful not to disturb his mood. He shook his head, closing the book gently. "No, Kimberly, thank you." She offered him a small smile before disappearing down the hall, leaving the library hushed once more. Daniel leaned back in the chair, the firelight flickering across his face. His jaw tightened. Whoever Amber Thatcher was, she was about to change the trajectory of his life, whether he wanted it or not. Amber Thatcher's voice rang through her penthouse office, sharp and urgent, echoing against the tall glass windows that overlooked the city skyline. She held her phone in a white-knuckled grip, pacing across the room in her tailored heels. "Push harder! We are running out of time!" she snapped, her frustration boiling over. "I don't care what it takes. Make this happen soon. Set up a date and let me do the rest." Slamming the phone onto her desk, Amber exhaled, her chest rising and falling in quick bursts. She hated feeling the pressure, hated the sensation that the board was pulling strings. But if she wanted her future secured, she had to win, and Daniel Calloway was the key. She pressed another button on her phone. "Get in here," she ordered. Her assistant, a timid young woman named Claire, stepped into the room, clutching a tablet against her chest. Amber wasted no time. "What do we have on Daniel Calloway?" Claire hesitated, shifting on her feet. "Not much about his personal life. He's very private, guarded. Most of his schedule is sealed. His staff is tight-lipped too. We've tried reaching out discreetly, but they won't talk. They're loyal to him." Amber's eyes narrowed, sharp as glass. "Then offer them money." "We have," Claire said softly. "Then offer them more money?" Amber screamed, her voice rising high enough to make Claire flinch. "I need information, and I need it now. I don't care how you get it. He has weaknesses. Everyone does. Find them." Silence fell heavy in the room. Amber leaned against her desk, her breath slowing, her jaw set. If Daniel thought he could resist her, he was about to learn just how ruthless she could be. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive in the city, tucked behind frosted glass walls and hidden gardens. The kind of place where privacy was purchased with the same ease as the wine. Daniel Calloway arrived early, his suit pressed, his expression unreadable. He had seen Amber Thatcher before at corporate galas and charity functions, always exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. Tonight would be different. When she entered, the room seemed to bend toward her presence. Amber was striking in a sapphire silk dress, every detail carefully chosen to impress. She moved toward him with a confidence that drew eyes, but her gaze was fixed only on Daniel. "Mr. Calloway," she greeted, her voice warm, her smile practiced but radiant. "Miss Thatcher," he replied coolly, standing just long enough to acknowledge her before taking his seat again. Amber didn't waste a second. Once the waiter poured the wine and retreated, she leaned in, her charm rolling off her like perfume. Compliments about his reputation, subtle admiration for his achievements. It was a performance as flawless as it was relentless. Daniel listened with the faintest of smirks tugging at his mouth. He was used to flattery. In fact, it often bored him. But she was persistent, weaving her words with careful precision. It took him a moment, but eventually his shoulders eased a fraction. "You are a very difficult man to charm," Amber teased, tilting her head with a playful grin. He arched a brow. "I'm not used to charming companions. Most of my days are spent dealing with difficult people and impossible situations." Amber laughed lightly, her hand gliding across the table until it rested on his. "Then I'll consider it an honor if I can pull even half a smile from you tonight." Daniel returned the smile, though it was faint, almost reluctant. Her touch made him shift slightly in his chair, uncomfortable, yet intrigued. "Tell me about yourself," she pressed. "What do you do when you're not commanding boardrooms and silencing your rivals?" He let out a low chuckle, surprising even himself. "I yell at people all day." Her laughter filled the space between them, bright and genuine, or at least practiced enough to seem so. "That's interesting," she said, eyes sparkling with curiosity. But Daniel wasn't fooled. Beneath her charm, he could feel her hunger. He was amazed at how hard Amber was working, how carefully she crafted her questions, fishing for anything she could use. He smiled again, though this time with calculation. Amber wasn't the only one who could play a game. Amber slammed her clutch onto the glass coffee table as soon as she returned home. Her heels clicked angrily against the polished marble floor. As she paced her living room, Claire, her assistant, sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, tablet in hand, waiting for the storm to pass. "Well?" Amber demanded, dropping into a chair and tugging at her earrings. "I worked harder tonight than I have in years, and what do I have to show for it? Nothing. The man is a wall. He gives nothing away. I compliment, I touch, I laugh at his dry jokes, and still nothing." Claire hesitated, then cleared her throat. "He's guarded, but maybe you're pushing too hard. Sometimes people are more open when they're comfortable." Amber shot her a sharp look. "Comfortable?" "Yes," Claire continued carefully. "Dinner at a high-end restaurant puts him in defense mode. But if you meet him somewhere familiar, somewhere he feels at ease, he might loosen up. What about lunch at his place, maybe in the garden? Men like him, they have pride in their homes. He may reveal more there." Amber leaned back, considering it. A slow smile crept across her lips. "Lunch at his place, casual. He can't hide behind reservations and restaurant staff." Clever, Claire. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and typed a short, polished message. "Would you be willing to host lunch this Saturday? I'd love to see your garden." She barely had time to set the phone down before it vibrated with his reply. That would be nice. 1 p.m. this Saturday. Amber's smile widened, triumphant. He replied quickly. "That's a good sign," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She typed a warm response and sent it instantly, sealing the arrangement. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel Calloway stood in his study with the phone still in his hand. He dialed the house line, and moments later, Kimberly appeared in the doorway, notebook ready. "Did you get that done?" he asked. "Yes, I have. The menu is being arranged now." "Good. I have a lunch date this Saturday at the house, in the garden. Make sure everything is up to standard." Kimberly gave a crisp nod. "Of course, I'll see to it." Daniel ended the call and leaned back against his desk, thoughtful. Amber Thatcher wanted lunch at his home? Fine. But this time he would be the one setting the tone. Saturday arrived quickly, and with it came a kind of bright, calm afternoon that seemed almost staged for such an occasion. The Calloway estate gleamed in the sun, its sprawling gardens manicured to perfection. Kimberly, dressed neatly in her usual uniform, greeted Amber Thatcher at the front door with the poised politeness she extended to all of Daniel's guests. "This way, Miss Thatcher," she said, guiding her through a glass corridor that opened out into the garden. Amber took it all in with deliberate appreciation, the ivy-climbing stone arches, the marble fountain bubbling softly, the symphony of roses and lavender swaying in the breeze. It was a stage, and she intended to play her role flawlessly. Daniel was seated at a wrought-iron table, shaded by a canopy of climbing roses, his tablet in hand. When he noticed them, he immediately stood, setting the device aside. "Amber," he greeted, his tone even. "I'm glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," she replied, smiling as if the entire afternoon had been crafted for her benefit. He extended a hand toward the silver pitcher on the table. "Something to drink? Lemon water? Tea?" "Tea, thank you." She accepted. The glass he poured, their fingertips brushing briefly before she settled into her seat. Before the food arrived, Daniel offered a small apology. "I should mention I have a call at 2. An investor, but it shouldn't take long." Amber's smile never faltered. "No problem at all. I'm aware of your busy schedule, and I'm just grateful you made time for me. Hopefully," she leaned slightly closer, her voice warm, "this will be the first of many such afternoons." Daniel's eyes flickered to hers, unreadable. "Hopefully," he echoed. The conversation began with safe territory, the Calloway family business, the traditions that weighed on them both, education, their experiences abroad. Nothing too personal, nothing too vulnerable, but Amber worked hard to lace her curiosity with light laughter and attentiveness. Daniel gave measured responses, polite, but never yielding more than he chose. Then the phone in his pocket buzzed. He glanced at the screen, excused himself, and walked toward another part of the garden to take the call. Amber's eyes followed him until he was out of earshot. Then, almost without hesitation, she stood. Her heels clicked softly against the stone path as she retraced her steps back into the house. The interior was just as impressive as the gardens, sleek lines of polished wood, curated art, and the kind of quiet wealth that spoke louder than words. She moved quickly, driven by a need to seize whatever opportunity she could find. It didn't take her long to locate his office. The door was unlocked. Inside, the space was everything she expected. Dark oak shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a massive desk that commanded the center of the room, drawers neatly arranged. She ran her hands along the polished surface before tugging one drawer. Open inside were ledgers, contracts, notes written in Daniel's hand. She flipped through quickly, scanning for anything useful, personal details, vulnerabilities, secrets hidden in plain sight. But before she could dig further, a quiet voice interrupted her. "Ms. Thatcher." Amber froze. She turned slowly to find Kimberly standing in the doorway, her posture straight, her expression polite yet firm. "Can I help you?" Kimberly asked, though her tone carried more authority than the question suggested. Amber's lips curved into a faint smile. "I was just looking around, getting a sense of the place. You know, Daniel and I are friends. I'm sure he wouldn't mind." Kimberly stepped into the room, her voice soft but unwavering. "Mr. Calloway is very strict about his privacy. I must ask you to leave, please." Amber's eyes narrowed, studying the woman before her. She was no ordinary maid. That much was clear. Kimberly carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew her employer's trust was absolute. "You would know, wouldn't you?" Amber said finally, her tone edged with both challenge and acknowledgement. "Yes, I suppose you would." She closed the drawer gently, smoothed her dress, and brushed past Kimberly with a measured grace. "Of course," Amber added over her shoulder, her smile returning as though nothing had happened. I wouldn't want to upset him. Kimberly watched her go, eyes steady, before closing the office door firmly behind her. Back in the garden, Amber returned to her seat just as Daniel ended his call. He walked toward her, expression calm, unaware of what had just transpired inside his home. Amber lifted her glass of tea and smiled at him, her charm sliding seamlessly back into place. But deep inside, she was unsettled, not by Daniel this time, but by the maid who guarded him more fiercely than she expected. And for the first time, Amber realized this game might not be as simple as she thought. When the lunch was over, Daniel escorted Amber back through the house with flawless courtesy. He opened the front door himself, allowing Kimberly to step aside as Amber slipped into her sleek black car. She gave him one last smile through the window before the driver pulled away, leaving the Calloway estate in silence once more. Daniel stood still, hands in his pockets, watching until the car disappeared down the long drive. Only then did he turn to Kimberly, his expression calm but edged with curiosity. "How long did it take her to head for my office?" he asked. "Immediately," Kimberly answered without hesitation. "She didn't bother pretending. Went straight there as soon as you stepped away." Daniel's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Good, that's what I expected." "She did go through a drawer," Kimberly added carefully. He tilted his head. "Did she take anything?" Kimberly nodded once. "Yes, a phone. Likely one of the spares from the drawer you'd already cleared." Daniel chuckled, a low, amused sound. "Perfect. Let her think she's found something." He paused, his gaze sharp with calculation. "Maybe next time I'll leave the computer on for her." Kimberly raised a brow, her tone dry. "You'd enjoy that far too much." He laughed outright then, a rare sound, shaking his head. "Perhaps, but people reveal more when they believe. They've stolen something valuable. Let her feel clever. It'll make her careless." Kimberly inclined her head, understanding the game as well as he did. "I'll keep watch." Meanwhile, across town, Amber sank into her sofa with a glass of wine, her sapphire dress discarded across a chair. She replayed the afternoon in her mind, Daniel's measured charm, the guarded small talk, and then the moment she'd found herself in his office. She had been pleased at first. She'd gotten past his walls, stepped into the heart of his privacy. But the maid, Kimberly, that woman's calm authority had unsettled her. She hadn't expected resistance from a servant, let alone one who seemed to stand like a gatekeeper. To Daniel's entire world, Amber swirled her wine, lips tightening. "I'll need to teach her how to stay in her place," she muttered to herself. No maid, no matter how loyal, would stand between her and what she wanted. But even as she spoke, the words, a flicker of unease passed through her. For the first time, Amber wondered if Daniel was letting her in or setting the stage for her downfall. The next evening, Daniel sat in a quiet corner of a private club reserved for men of his standing, an establishment where velvet curtains kept conversations from escaping, and discretion was etched into every polished surface. A decanter of amber whiskey sat between him and his guest, the glass catching the glow of the chandelier overhead. Across from him sat Adrian Holt, one of the few people Daniel trusted outside of his household. Adrian was a longtime friend and occasional partner in business ventures, a man who understood both the power of silence and the value of well-timed truths. Daniel poured them each a drink, sliding one glass across the table. "You've heard about the board's latest push?" Adrian's brow arched as he lifted the glass. "Amber Thatcher?" Daniel leaned back, eyes narrowing. "They're insistent. 1 year. That's the arrangement they keep circling back to." Adrian swirled his whiskey thoughtfully. "Amber is ambitious, ruthless even. I can see why the board would favor her. She's charming in public, strategic in private. She has the kind of hunger they like to harness. But I can't see why. They'd force you into it unless—" He paused, Unless she brings something else to the table. Daniel's jaw tightened. Exactly. What am I missing? Why her and why now? Adrian took a slow sip before answering. Her family's connections. The Thatchers may not hold your kind of influence, but they've been maneuvering into industries that overlap with yours. If she marries you, even briefly, she gains legitimacy, and her family gains leverage. The board gets stability. But for you, you inherit a snake in your garden. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. I already saw that firsthand. She walked into my office the moment I stepped away for a call, took a phone I planted in plain sight. Adrian chuckled, shaking his head. Testing her? Daniel smirked. Of course, if she's desperate for information, I'll give her enough rope to tangle herself. Adrian's gaze sharpened. Then you need to play this carefully. If the board wants her tied to you, there's a larger game at work. But remember, Daniel, snakes can bite even when you think you've caged them. Daniel lifted his glass. In a silent toast, his eyes cold with resolve. Let's see who gets bitten first. Amber Thatcher stared at the slim phone lying on her vanity the entire evening after her lunch at the Calloway estate. She had copied everything she could, from the device, contacts, fragments of messages, even files she barely understood. It hadn't been as revealing as she hoped, but there were enough puzzle pieces to convince her she could use it later. Now, however, she had to return it. Better to make it seem like an innocent mistake than risk Daniel discovering she had it. At all, the following afternoon, Amber stood once again at the imposing front doors of the Calloway estate. Kimberly opened them with her usual poise, her eyes flicking briefly to the object in Amber's hand. Good afternoon, Miss Thatcher, Kimberly said evenly. I wasn't expecting to see you today. Amber's smile was warm, but edged with intent. Yes, I came to return this. I must have accidentally slipped it into my bag yesterday. I'd like to give it to Daniel personally, if he's in. Kimberly's gaze lingered a second too long, as if she saw straight through the act, but her tone remained polite. Follow me, please. Amber was led to the library, its tall shelves and heavy curtains giving the air of a sanctuary. Kimberly excused herself and returned a few minutes later with Daniel. Amber, he said, his expression unreadable but polite. Nice to see you again. She stepped forward, extending the phone with a gracious smile. I believe this belongs to you. Daniel accepted it, his eyes cool but steady. Thank you. I had been looking for that. He paused, then tilted his head. Would you like to stay for lunch? Amber's smile widened. Yes, that would be lovely. Kimberly arranged the meal swiftly, setting the table with her characteristic efficiency. Amber, however, seemed determined to test boundaries. She moved her glass just after Kimberly had set it down, asked for small adjustments in the dishes, and offered pointed comments cloaked as compliments. Each time, Kimberly responded with patience and precision, though her jaw grew tighter. When Daniel stepped out briefly to take a call, Amber seized her chance. She leaned back in her chair, her voice laced with challenge. You do realize, Kimberly, Amber began smoothly, that your constant interruptions and rules are unnecessary. I'm not used to being managed by household staff. Kimberly placed the tray down firmly, meeting Amber's gaze head-on. Let's make something clear, Ms. Thatcher. If you keep pushing me, I will push back. And believe me, Mr. Calloway wouldn't appreciate that. All of his employees are loyal to him, completely. Getting rid of us would be like getting you to actually fall in love with Mr. Calloway. Her tone sharpened, deliberate, very difficult. Amber's eyes flared. She rose to her feet, her temper breaking through her polished mask. You, little... The door opened. Daniel stepped back into the room, his eyes moving instantly between the two women. What's going on? Amber drew in a breath, her voice quick and defensive. Your maid needs to know her place. Daniel's gaze shifted to Kimberly, who stood calm, hands folded in front of her. "And what place is that?" he asked slowly. Amber crossed her arms. "She seems to think she's in charge of you and your home." Daniel studied Amber for a long moment before turning back to Kimberly. "That's because she is." The words landed like a hammer. Amber blinked, momentarily, thrown off balance. "You allow her that kind of authority?" "I trust her," Daniel said plainly, "more than most. Do you have a problem with my staff, Amber?" Amber's jaw tightened. For a moment, defiance flickered in her eyes, but she smoothed it away, replacing it with a careful smile. "No, of course not. I'm simply not used to being spoken to in that way. Most household staff nod and accept what I say." "Well," Daniel replied, his tone final, "this is my home, and things are different here." Amber hesitated, then inclined her head gracefully, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'll remember that in the future." Kimberly stood silently, her expression composed, though a flicker of triumph glimmered beneath the surface. Daniel's loyalty was clear, and Amber, for all her charm and ambition, had just been reminded that she was playing on his ground, not her own. Amber. Thatcher's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor of Marco Hayward's penthouse. Sweet. Her expression was tight, her fury still simmering from the confrontation at Daniel's estate. Kimberly's calm defiance played in her head like an unwelcome echo. Marco was already waiting, lounging in a leather chair with a crystal glass in hand. His smile was the kind that held more calculation than warmth. "You look like you've just swallowed fire," he remarked smoothly, gesturing for her to sit. Amber sank into the chair opposite him, crossing her legs with practiced poise. "It's more difficult than I thought. His staff guard him like a fortress, especially that maid. She's more than an employee, she's a watchdog." Marco chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Daniel always had a way of surrounding himself with loyalists. That's why he's such a problem, but every fortress has a crack." Amber's lips curved into a sly smile as she reached into her bag. She slid a slim folder across the table, toward him. "I found one, or at least the start of one." Marco leaned forward, flipping open the folder. Inside were copies of files Amber had pulled from the phone she'd stolen. Names, numbers, hints of correspondence. Fragments, but enough to suggest avenues of pressure. "This is good," Marco murmured, eyes scanning the pages. "Very good." He looked up at her, his grin widening. "Well, sweetheart, once we strip everything from Daniel, once he's standing with nothing left to protect, you can have your little field day with the maid. Teach her whatever lesson you think she deserves." Amber's anger cooled into satisfaction. She reached across the table, snatched Marco's untouched shot of whiskey, and threw it back in one smooth motion. The burn in her throat mirrored the fire in her chest, but her smile was sharp and triumphant. "Then let's get to work," she said, her eyes glittering. Marco raised his glass in a slow toast, his gaze steady. "To Daniel Calloway's downfall." Amber clinked her empty glass against his, the sound ringing like a promise. For her, this wasn't just about winning the board's approval anymore. It was about tearing down the fortress brick by brick and enjoying every second of it. The following week, Daniel sat across from Adrian in his private office, the air thick with quiet tension. Folders and files lay spread across the desk, evidence collected with meticulous care. Adrian leaned forward, tapping one page with the tip of his finger. "You were right," Adrian said, his voice low. "Amber isn't acting alone. Marco Hayward's name has come up more than once. Meetings disguised as business dinners. Phone, records tracing back months, and," he slid another sheet across the desk, "financial transfers. Subtle, but connected." Daniel picked up the sheet, his expression hardening as he read. He didn't need to say Marco's name aloud. Just the thought of his rival working behind the scenes was enough to make his jaw clench. "And Amber," Daniel asked. Adrian nodded grimly. They've been seeing each other in secret for months. This isn't some sudden partnership. It's calculated. She's been playing you while feeding him whatever scraps she could gather. It's not about the board anymore, Daniel. It's about dismantling you. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. A flicker of dark amusement touched his mouth. So the board pushes her onto me, thinking they're securing stability. Meanwhile, she's bedding my rival and plotting my downfall. Adrian's lips curved into a thin smile. Irony has a cruel sense of humor. Silence fell between them for a long moment, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Daniel's eyes sharpened, his voice edged with steel. Good. Let her think she's winning. Let Marco believe he has the upper hand. If they want a game, we'll give them one, but on my terms. Adrian raised his glass of whiskey, nodding. What's your move? Daniel allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Expose the cracks in their alliance. People like Amber and Marco, ambition binds them, but ambition also divides. All it takes is pressure in the right place, and they'll turn on each other. Adrian's grin widened. And when they do? Daniel's eyes gleamed with cold certainty. We'll be ready to collect the pieces. Weeks slipped by in a rhythm that looked, to outsiders, like the blossoming of a romance. Daniel and Amber were seen together often, at restaurants where every table turned to watch, at charity events where cameras captured her hand on his arm, and even at the Calloway estate, where her presence became almost routine. People began to whisper. Some believed Daniel was softening, finally letting someone in. Others thought Amber had secured the board's blessing and was cementing her position. As the inevitable Mrs. Calloway, Amber basked in the attention. The more she appeared by his side, the more emboldened she felt. Daniel played his part with quiet precision. He let her believe she was gaining ground, even leaving her alone in his office for long stretches. At first, she crept cautiously through, his drawers and files, always glancing over her shoulder. But after a time, her nerves faded. She began to sit in his leather chair, to run her fingers over the spines of his books as if she owned them, to lean back and imagine herself reigning over the space. At the estate, she moved with a practiced air of comfort, directing small talk, with staff requesting tea, even daring to linger late into the evening. Yet for all her attempts, she still met resistance at every turn, resistance shaped like Kimberly. Kimberly's presence remained unshakable, her quiet authority a wall Amber couldn't scale without offending Daniel. Every subtle maneuver Amber tried, insinuations, sly remarks, testing boundaries, fell flat. Kimberly never raised her voice, never lost her composure, but her loyalty was immovable, and Daniel noticed. One evening, as Amber sipped wine in the garden while Daniel took a call, Kimberly set a tray beside her. Their eyes met for a brief, silent moment. Amber's smile tightened, her voice sweet but biting. You do love hovering, don't you? Kimberly inclined her head with a polite smile. It's my job, Miss Thatcher. Amber looked away, but her mind was already racing. Kimberly wasn't simply staff. She was an obstacle, perhaps the greatest of all. If Amber was going to claim everything she wanted, she would need to find a way to move Kimberly out of the picture. Somehow, Kimberly stood in the grand entryway, her jacket folded neatly over her arm. Amber had just arrived, her perfume already filling the hall. Mr. Calloway will be home in about an hour, Kimberly said calmly. But I need to step out for a family matter. The rest of the staff has the evening off. Amber's brows lifted, surprise flashing for only a moment before a slow smile spread across her lips. Really? Well, I can manage on my own, after all. She let her gaze sweep over the marble floors, the polished banisters, the oil paintings lining the walls. One day this might be my home. Kimberly's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Yes, that is possible. The words hung. In the air, deceptively neutral, before Kimberly slipped into the night. Amber turned slowly, her heels clicking as she moved from room to room. Silence wrapped around her like a cloak. No voices, no footsteps, no watchful eyes. For the first time, the Calloway estate was hers to explore. She tested each hallway, peering into drawing rooms and salons, but her feet inevitably carried her to the office. The door opened easily. She entered, closing it softly behind her. The heavy desk dominated the room, its surface spotless, its presence commanding. She ran her fingers along the edge before settling into the leather chair. A thrill coursed through her. It felt right, as if she belonged here. The computer glowed faintly when she pressed the power button. To her shock, the desktop opened immediately, no password prompt to stop her. She smirked. "He trusts them completely," she muttered. "Doesn't even bother to set a lock. Foolish." From her purse, she produced a slim thumb drive and slid it into the port. The screen flickered as files transferred rapidly, contracts, correspondence, confidential ledgers. She copied everything she could, her pulse quickening with each passing second. By the time the download completed, she was radiant with triumph. Removing the drive, she smoothed her hair, tucked it away, and made her way to the library. There, she poured herself a generous glass of wine and sank into a velvet chair. When Daniel arrived, the first thing he saw was Amber, relaxed and glowing, her smile stretching across her cheeks as if she had conquered something monumental. "Welcome home," she said sweetly, raising her glass in greeting. Amber arrived at Marco Hayward's penthouse late that same night, her eyes alight with triumph. She tossed her coat onto a chair, poured herself a drink from his crystal decanter without waiting to be offered, and collapsed onto the leather sofa with a satisfied sigh. Marco looked up from the papers spread across his coffee table. His sharp features softened into a grin at the sight of her confidence. "You look like a woman who's just stolen fire from the gods," he drawled. Amber smirked, pulling the slim thumb drive from her purse. She held it up between two fingers like a prized jewel. "Better. I stole Daniel Calloway's empire. Piece by piece, file by file. His trust in that staff of his is laughable. No password, no locks. It was almost too easy." Marco's brows lifted as he reached for the drive. "So you finally broke through his fortress." "Every wall has a crack," Amber said proudly, tossing back her drink. "And I found his. This," she tapped the drive as he examined it, "is everything. Contracts, ledgers, private correspondence, enough to bleed him dry and leave." "Him crawling," Marco laughed, a deep, satisfied sound that filled the room. "You've outdone yourself, sweetheart. When we finish with him, he'll have nothing left to cling to, and you'll finally be rid of that maid you despise so much." Amber leaned back, closing her eyes, savoring the image. Kimberly, powerless. Daniel stripped of his empire, herself standing victorious beside Marco. "It's already in motion," she whispered. "All we have to do now is press the right buttons." Marco poured them both another drink, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To Calloway's fall." Amber clinked her glass against his, her smile wide and radiant. She had never felt more certain of her victory. But far across the city, Daniel Calloway sat in his office, sipping his own glass of whiskey, a faint smirk curling his lips. He already knew where the stolen files had gone, because he had put them there himself. The celebration had begun, yes, but not for Amber and Marco. The Calloway boardroom was tense, the kind of airless silence that came when billions were at stake. The long mahogany table stretched like a battlefield, and at its head sat Daniel, his arms crossed, expression carved from stone. Around him, board members murmured in uneasy clusters, their eyes fixed on the plummeting stock numbers projected on the wall. Marco Hayward's campaign had worked. Rumors of mismanagement spread like wildfire, media outlets circling like vultures, investors selling in fear. Within a week, Calloway Industries' stock had dropped to its lowest point in years. Amber Thatcher, dressed in a tailored cream suit, swept into the room with a dramatic sense of timing. Her heels echoed as she approached the table, folder in, and smile carefully constructed to appear both sympathetic and confident. "Gentlemen, ladies," she began, her voice silky and commanding. "I understand the panic. I understand the fear, but I also have a solution." All eyes turned toward her. She placed her folder on the table and leaned forward. "If Daniel and I were to formalize our partnership, if we were to marry, our families would unite. The Thatcher Group is strong, liquid, and untouched by scandal. We could steady this ship before it capsizes." A murmur rippled through the boardroom. Heads nodded. Some members whispered to one another with visible relief. Daniel's gaze never shifted. He remained silent until one of the senior board members cleared his throat. "Daniel, you've always been decisive. Would you consider this? The optics of such an alliance might calm the markets." Finally, Daniel's lips curved into the faintest smile, but it was cold. "No." The word hit the table like a gavel. The room stilled. Amber's smile faltered before she quickly recovered, her eyes flashing with annoyance. And then, as if summoned by that single refusal, Marco Hayward strode into the boardroom, flanked by two aides carrying sleek binders. His presence sucked the air from the room, his grin sharp as he approached the table. Perhaps Daniel would refuse such a reasonable solution because he has something to hide, Marco said smoothly. He slapped one binder down on the table, flipping it open with a flourish. "Evidence of mismanagement, deliberate concealment of issues within his divisions, and," he added, savoring the pause, "failure to report problems that could have prevented this very crisis." Gasps and whispers erupted. The board members looked from Marco to Daniel, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. "Daniel," the chairman said at last, his voice heavy, "what do you have to say about this?" Daniel slowly unfolded his arms, glancing at the stack of documents as though they were nothing more than a child's drawings. Then he looked at Marco, his eyes calm and utterly unshaken. "What do I have to say?" His voice was low, steady. He stood, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate precision. "Let's take a 15-minute break. Everyone relax. Have some coffee. Stretch your legs." He smiled faintly, a predator's smile. "And then I'll speak." The room buzzed with uneasy energy as board members exchanged confused glances. Marco's grin faltered ever so slightly, as though sensing that Daniel wasn't cornered at all. He was waiting. When the board reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. Every member perched forward in their seats, whispering anxiously. Marco sat at one end of the table, smug and self-assured, while Amber lingered close, her cream suit pristine, her smile, brittle but still intact. Daniel entered last, his stride unhurried, his composure unshaken. He took his place at the head of the table, placed a slim black folder before him, and allowed the silence to stretch until it felt unbearable. Then he looked directly at Marco. "You've had your performance," Daniel said evenly. "Now it's my turn." Marco leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "By all means," Daniel tapped the folder once. "The documents you presented are fabricated. Sloppy work, really. Enough to stir fear in the market, but not enough to withstand scrutiny. You see, I've been aware of your alliance for some time. You and Ms. Thatcher have been meeting in secret for months." Amber stiffened, her carefully practiced poise cracking for the first time. "That's absurd," she snapped. "Absurd." Daniel's smile was razor sharp. He opened the folder and slid a glossy photograph across the table. "This is the two of you at the Belmont Hotel, 3 months ago." The board members leaned in, murmurs rising. Daniel calmly produced more photographs. Marco and Amber at a secluded restaurant, walking arm in arm through a park, heads bent close together in whispered conversation. Amber's face drained of color. "Those could have been taken out of Context, she said quickly. I meet with many people. Daniel cut her off. Then perhaps this will provide clarity. He lifted a remote and clicked. The large monitor at the front of the room flickered to life. A video played. Grainy, but clear enough. It showed Amber sitting at his desk, sliding a thumb drive into his computer. Files transferring rapidly across the screen. Gasps filled the room. Daniel's voice remained calm, though steel laced every word. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Miss Thatcher stealing confidential company data. And she wasn't working alone. Marco was her partner, her financier, her so-called savior for this very crisis he engineered. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Shouts, accusations, questions, hurled across the table. Amber stood trembling, her voice shrill. This is a setup. He planted that computer. He's framing me. Marco slammed his fist on the table. You can't prove! The doors opened with a heavy click. 2 men in dark suits entered, badges raised. Marco Hayward, Amber Thatcher, we have a warrant for your arrest. The room fell into stunned silence. Marco's face blanched. Amber's hands shook as the agent stepped forward. Both began to protest, voices overlapping in frantic denial. But the sight of the FBI agents escorting them out silenced every word. Daniel remained seated, his arms once again crossed. His eyes swept over the stunned faces of the board members. Now, as I was saying, he began smoothly, about stabilizing our stock and moving forward. And for the first time in weeks, the board members leaned back in their chairs, relief flooding their expressions. The storm had broken, and Daniel Calloway was still standing. The Calloway estate was quiet again, the turmoil of the past weeks fading like a storm retreating beyond the horizon. Daniel pushed open the front door, loosened his tie, and called into the silence with a rare warmth in his voice. Honey, I'm home. From the hallway, Kimberly appeared, her expression softening the moment she saw him. She set aside the ledger she'd been carrying and walked toward him. Without hesitation, she rose on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips. Daniel smiled against her mouth, then pulled back just enough to look down into her eyes. So, he murmured, his tone, playful but edged with sincerity, when are we going to tell everyone we're married? Kimberly rested her head against his chest, her arms slipping easily around his waist. I like it just like this, she whispered. Just us. No board, no public, no one else's opinion. He leaned back slightly, studying her face. Sweetheart, you know there will always be other women chasing after me, or board members trying to parade some polished candidate in front of me to improve my image. Kimberly exhaled slowly, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. She knew he was right. As long as their marriage remained hidden, there would always be whispers, schemes, and power plays aimed at Daniel's personal life. Yet she also knew the moment their union became public, her quiet role as his confidant and partner would change forever. Not yet, she said finally, lifting her head to meet his gaze. Only when it becomes absolutely necessary. Until then, I want this to stay ours alone. Daniel's expression softened, the steel of the businessman giving way to the tenderness of the man beneath. He cupped her chin, tilting her face upward. Then so be it, he said, his voice low, resolute. We'll keep it ours until the world forces our hand. He kissed her then, slow, deliberate, sealing the promise between them. Kimberly melted into him, her heart steady against his chest. For all the power struggles, betrayals, and boardroom wars, this was the one truth neither of them needed to prove to anyone. For now, the secret was safe, and together they would decide. When the world was ready to know, Amber Thatcher sat in the back of a sleek black car, her phone glowing in her hand as she spoke with a journalist eager for scandal. Her smile was sharp, her tone dripping with venom. Daniel Calloway's empire is not as stable as it looks, she purred. His staff isn't as loyal as he pretends. Take Kimberly, for example, his so-called trusted house manager. She's been stealing from him for months. I have proof." The proof, of course, was fabricated. But Amber knew that with the media, perception often mattered more than truth. Within hours, headlines splashed across screens. Calloway betrayed by his inner circle. By the next morning, the board demanded an emergency meeting. Daniel sat at the head of the table, composed as always, though his eyes burned with quiet fury. The board members leaned in, papers in hand, voices tight with accusation. "Daniel," the chairman began, "this is serious. Allegations of theft, disloyalty, your household staff of all people. How can we be certain your judgment isn't compromised?" Before Daniel could reply, Kimberly entered the room. She had never addressed the board directly before, but today she walked with a steady calm that drew every eye. "Enough," she said firmly, standing beside her husband. "We've been married for over a year, and during that time, this company has thrived, not suffered. The problem isn't Daniel's judgment. The problem is who he chooses to love." A hush fell over the room. The word married echoed like a dropped stone in still water. Board members exchanged shocked looks, their whispers sharp with disbelief. Daniel rose then, slipping an arm protectively around Kimberly's waist. His voice was low but resolute. "Yes, Kimberly is my wife, has been for over a year, and if you believe that diminishes my ability to run this company, then perhaps it's your judgment that needs questioning, not mine." For a moment, the boardroom was frozen. Then the chairman cleared his throat. "This is highly irregular, Daniel. You chose to keep this hidden from us." Kimberly spoke before Daniel could. "It was my choice," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes glistened. "Because of the press, because of Daniel's social circles, and the endless scrutiny over who a man like him should marry. I didn't want our marriage to become a weapon used against him, or this company. So I asked him to keep it private." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the room. Daniel squeezed her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "She asked, and I respected her, because she's my wife, my partner, my equal, and no one, not the board, not the press, not rivals like Marco or bitter voices like Amber Thatcher, will ever change that." The board sat back, silenced not by intimidation, but by conviction. For all his power, Daniel had never spoken with such raw honesty. It was disarming. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Kimberly stood together before a wall of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones jostled, questions fired in rapid succession. Daniel stood tall, his arm firmly around Kimberly's shoulders. "It's true," he said. "Kimberly and I have been married for over a year. We chose to keep it private, to protect ourselves from the noise and the scrutiny. It wasn't secrecy born of shame, it was a shield." Kimberly's voice wavered at first, then steadied as she leaned into the microphones. "I asked for that shield, because I knew how harsh this world could be towards someone like me. But let me be clear, my husband never wavered, and I stand beside him today because we are stronger together, not apart." Reporters shouted questions, but Daniel raised his hand, silencing the crowd. His final words rang with authority. "This marriage isn't a weakness, it's my strength, and anyone who doubts that is welcome to watch us prove it." The cameras caught the image of Daniel kissing Kimberly's forehead, her eyes closed, her smile radiant despite the storm. The story had broken, but instead of scandal, the world saw something else. Daniel Calloway, unshaken, standing proudly with the woman he chose. Amber Thatcher watched the live press conference from the shadows of her penthouse, her nails digging crescent moons into her palm as Daniel's words echoed through the screen. "This marriage isn't a weakness, it's my strength." Her glass of wine trembled in her hand before she hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the red streaking down like blood. "How dare he?" she hissed, pacing the length of the room. "How dare that maid, no, that wife, stand there, like she belongs in his world?" They've all fallen for it, every last one of them. She grabbed her phone, scrolling frantically through headlines. Instead of the scandal she expected, every outlet carried a different tone. Calloway marriage, a love story, hidden from the spotlight. Daniel and Kimberly, stronger together. Markets calm after Calloway confirms stability and family support. Amber's rage deepened with each line. Investors weren't panicking. The public wasn't jeering. If anything, the tide seemed to have shifted in Daniel's favor. What was meant to be her coup had turned into his coronation. "No," she muttered, pacing faster, her mind racing. "This isn't over. They may buy into this fairy tale now, but I'll show them. I'll prove she's not worthy." Her reflection in the darkened window stared back at her, eyes alight with fury. The battle wasn't over, not for her. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel and Kimberly returned to the Calloway estate. The moment they stepped inside, phones began buzzing non-stop. Adrian was already there, a smirk tugging at his lips as he tossed a newspaper onto the table. "Congratulations," Adrian said. "You two just turned what should have been a scandal into the most effective rebranding campaign I've ever seen. Investors are already calling me. They're calming down. Some even say this proves you're human, Daniel." Daniel chuckled, loosening his tie. Human. Imagine that. Kimberly stood beside him, still overwhelmed by the flashing cameras and endless microphones from earlier. She sank into a chair, pressing a hand to her chest. "I can't believe it. I thought they'd hate me, that I'd ruin everything." Adrian leaned against the mantel, his tone softening. "You don't see what everyone else sees. You grounded him. That boardroom was stunned today, not because of the marriage, but because you defended him with more conviction than anyone else in that room ever has. That's what they'll remember." Daniel bent down, brushing a kiss against Kimberly's. "Temple, you were brilliant, sweetheart. You told the truth, and it worked." Kimberly managed a smile, though her eyes shimmered. "It still feels surreal. One moment Amber's painting me as a thief, the next we're standing before the world saying we're married." Daniel's hand tightened around hers. "That's because Amber underestimated you. She thought you'd be fragile. She thought loyalty was a weakness. But today, you showed her what strength looks like." Adrian raised his glass. "To loyalty, and to a marriage built stronger than stock prices." Kimberly laughed softly as Daniel poured her a drink. For the first time in weeks, the tension began to ease. Outside the estate, the world buzzed with news, headlines, speculation. But inside, in the warmth of their home, the truth was simple. They had weathered the storm. And though Amber Thatcher raged in the shadows, though Marco's schemes had failed, Daniel and Kimberly stood stronger than ever, united not just by love, but by the unshakable certainty that no board, no rival, no lie could tear them apart. The tide had turned. The end. Thank you for listening to Green Tea Tales. Hope you enjoyed today's story. Help our channel to grow with like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe.